Hello and welcome to another episode of Piano TV. I am Allysia, your host, and today we are going to be looking at the life and times of Edvard Grieg, who was a Romantic era composer. He lived in the same time period as guys like Chopin and Liszt, but Grieg is a little bit less known, even though there's some compositions of his that you've almost definitely heard before. And if you saw our video that we did recently on the music of Grieg, you'll see what I'm talking about. We will touch on his music a little bit today. What we're mainly going to be talking about in this video is his life. We're going to talk about his life story. It's not like a crazy drama story. There's no like womanizing or I don't know. Some of our composers in the past have been a little bit more dramatic, like Tchaikovsky or Chopin. But that's not to say that Grieg wasn't interesting, because I think he is. Let's get started. Interestingly, Grieg's family has Scottish roots, and he can trace his lineage to Scottish clans, the Gregor clan, who migrated over to Norway in the 1770s, late 1700s. And like many prominent composers, Grieg was born into a fairly musical family. His mother was musical, and she was his first piano teacher. This is a story that we see a lot with composers, where they show some type of talent, like they sit down and play the piano and some random friend or family member is impressed. And that's exactly what happened with Grieg when he was 15 years old. This friend convinced his parents to send 15-year-old Grieg to the conservatory in Leipzig, which was in Germany. And that began Grieg's musical adventures, where he got to do things like enjoy lots of concerts, but he wasn't a huge fan of the conservatory setting. He found it pretty stifling. He said, and I quote, that he left the conservatory as stupid as when I entered it. Grieg spent most of his life being fairly sickly, and that's largely in part because when he was 17 years old, he almost died from not just one lung infection, but two, one of them being tuberculosis. Miraculously, he survived, but he had a collapsed lung and never fully recovered from it, in addition to developing a type of scoliosis from his infections. Throughout his life, he had many respiratory tract infections and eventually would die from heart disease. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get to his death. One thing that was in vogue at the time was to travel to spas for those people with lung infections and tuberculosis. Chopin did this as well, to regain their health, to give them some humidity and things like that. And that's something that Grieg did many times throughout his life. After almost dying as a teenager, Grieg then went on to perform as a concert pianist. He made his debut in 1861 in Sweden, and then he traveled around and performed in his own hometown, where he performed Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique. Between 1863 and 1866, Grieg lived in Copenhagen, Denmark. And that was an experience that was really useful for him, because he was able to meet and mingle with other important minds and composers. One such mind that he made friends with, I guess I should refer to him as a human, not a mind. We are more than our minds. His name, that's a sidetrack. His name was Rikard Nordraak of the Norwegian national anthem fame. He was the one who wrote the national anthem eventually. When Nordraak died in 1866 prematurely, Grieg ended up composing a funeral march for him that would then be played at his own funeral a little bit later, a lot later. As for his love life and marriage and father situation, there's not really a lot to talk about. The most wild thing about it is that he married his first cousin named Nina, which is... He was married in 1867 at age 24, and Nina was a musician as well. She was a soprano singer, so the two, I guess, had a lot in common in addition to sharing some genes. The two of them did have a child together named Alexandra, who unfortunately died due to meningitis when she was a toddler, and then never had any more children. Around this time, too, when he was getting married, he composed one of his most famous pieces, his concerto in A minor, which I just thought was worth mentioning because it's a famous piece. Liszt and Grieg were friends from afar. They both knew about each other, were active in the same time, and had a mutual respect for each other. Liszt, as we know, was obviously very famous, but he was also very generous. He ended up writing a testimonial for Grieg to Norway, which basically enabled Grieg to receive a travel grant. The two did end up meeting up in Rome. They met up a couple times, the first time in 1870. The first time they met, they played through Grieg's violin sonata, and Liszt was very impressed. He loved it. And then the second time they visited, Liszt famously sight-read Grieg's very difficult piano sonata, including like all the orchestral arrangements of it and everything, and gave him some encouragement. He said it was really good, but he also gave him some critique on improving the orchestration. Grieg, about Liszt's performance, said that Liszt played the first movement too fast. But, I mean, all those things aside, it was apparently a nice experience for all involved. In Grieg's midlife, he eventually returned to his hometown in Bergen to be the music director of the orchestra between 1880 and 1882, when he was about 40 years old. Much later, in 1894 and 1906, Grieg would go on to receive honorary doctorates from both the University of Cambridge and Oxford. Apparently, after he was given honorary doctorates, he liked signing his name Dr. Grieg. I mean, who wouldn't, right? Grieg was really inspired by Norwegian folk music, and upon returning to Norway, he would continue to pull from folk music into his pieces and compose pieces that either had folk music embedded in them or were specifically modeled after folk music. Grieg also had another famous person meet up with Tchaikovsky in 1888. Tchaikovsky, as we know, was another Romantic era giant. The two met up in Leipzig, and Grieg was starstruck. Tchaikovsky thought pretty well of Grieg as well, saying that Grieg's music had beauty, originality, and warmth. Grieg miraculously managed to live to a decently old age, given all of his health issues since he was a teenager. And by the time he was in older age, he was also receiving a pension from the Norwegian government since he was an icon. In 1885, Grieg and his wife Nina settled into their forever home in Troldhagen, which is basically just like a mountain home just outside of Bergen. Another fun fact is that Grieg was one of the first composers to make personal recordings of his music. In 1903, he made 9 gramophone recordings in Paris, recordings that are actually still available to listen to today, despite how primitive they are. Grieg died in Bergen, Norway in 1907 when he was 64 years old. The official cause of death was a massive heart attack, which followed a long period of illness. I love his last words. His last words were, "Well, if it must be so." Guys, that gets me. His funeral brought a crowd of 40,000 people into the streets in Norway, and his funeral march, which he had written for Nordrak, was played as per his request, in addition to a funeral march from Chopin's Second Piano Sonata. Grieg was cremated, and his ashes were entombed in a mountain crypt near Troldhagen, where he spent his later days. Nina's ashes were then also added to said crypt when she died. One of Grieg's most famous compositions of all time was the suite he created for Henrik Ibsen's play Per Gynt, and this was a play where there weren't any vocals or anything in the music. It was just pure background music, which he then condensed into a suite. And a musical suite is basically when you extract music from any type of dramatic setting, so it's just the music. His 3 violin sonatas and piano concerto were also really well known. But if you want to get more into the music of Grieg, we already did that video, so you can check that one out. Another composition that he wrote was the Holberg Suite, which was originally for the piano, but he eventually ended up scoring it for the strings as well. He wrote songs as well, and the lyrics he used were grafted from famous poems that were current in the time. He was a gifted piano player, and his piano music is among some of my favorite piano music, especially for intermediate students. And there's a large collection he made called Lyric Pieces for the piano, which range in difficulty from about grade 5 to 10. They're excellent. I always like to cap off these history videos with a discussion on the composer's personality. It's a little bit harder to do that for Grieg because he's just not as famous as guys like Beethoven, especially since guys like Beethoven were known for their stormy, kind of kooky personalities. I'm just gonna guess though, he seemed like a pretty solid and steady, straightforward dude. He didn't have multiple wives, he didn't have mistresses or friendships with dramatic clashing or anything like that. It basically just seems like he had congenial relationships with the people that he knew, and other composers seemed to like him. Basically, the distinct lack of drama and dirt on Grieg means that either he was just super private and we don't know much about him, or he was a decent guy. One thing that would speak in his favor that we know about him is that he once canceled some concerts in Paris to protest the Dreyfus affair, which is basically an anti-Semitic scandal. About the scandal, Grieg wrote that he hoped the French might soon return to the spirit of 1789, when the French Republic declared that it would defend basic human rights. He received a good amount of hate mail for that stance, but you have to, give the guy some credit for taking a stance against hate. That's +1 for Grieg. Another personal fact, this isn't so much of a personality thing, but maybe you could think of it that way. Him and his wife were Unitarians, which is basically just a branch of Christianity where they don't really believe in the Trinity. It's more like they don't think that Jesus is a God. Essentially, they think God is just God, and the Holy Trinity is not a thing. This is my very limited understanding of Unitarianism. Sorry about that. As for his physical description, we have one from Tchaikovsky, who said that his eyes were not very large, but incredibly fascinating. Interesting. Steamy. Grieg was also a small man, probably partly because of his sickness, both short and skinny. And apparently he was always around 110 pounds throughout his life. Another thing we know about Grieg is that he was really particular when composing. Apparently he needed just like complete absolute silence in order to concentrate. And maybe that's one reason that in his later life he ended up moving to the mountains, because that would definitely give him lots of quiet. And that is all for today's video on Grieg. I hope you enjoyed this tour through his life, which again wasn't anything crazy, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I think that he's an often overlooked composer, which is why we're going to be talking about him a little bit more in the coming months, because I think I like his music and I really like teaching his music, and that's all I got to say about that. One more quick thing before you go. If you notice on this channel, I have my vlog linked on the sidebar to like recommended channels or whatever, and my vlog is just called Allysia Vlogs. It's a very original name, but the reason I'm bringing it up is I'm planning on doing Vlogmas this year, and Vlogmas is basically just doing videos daily leading up to Christmas. It's not going to be a vlog every day. Some of them will be vlogs, but some of them will be more like sit down and have a conversation. So if you want to hang out with me in a context that isn't purely musical, you can join me on that channel. I will be starting that on December 1st in theory. Now, I don't think I'm going to do literally every day, but I will do most days leading up to Christmas. I think that'll be kind of like a fun, I don't know, just sounded like a fun thing to do, but that's my plug. All right, guys, I'll catch you in the next video. I literally just hit the record button, FYI.
I just cleaned up the cat part.